Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Airspeed's Korra Rewatch video. This one's going to be for K301, A Breath of Fresh Air, the start of Book 3 Change. So, very quickly, Book 3 in terms of, I suppose, what you can expect from my opinions. I've said before, it, for me, is the weakest book of Korra in that it's my least favorite, but I still like a lot of it. I'll very generally say that it tends to, for me, kind of be like the opposite of Book 2, whereas with Book 2 I think they nail the main plot of like the Korra Unalaq stuff through beginnings into the big spiritual stuff at the end, and maybe it's more the side plots that not all of them work as well. I think it's the opposite with Book 3, where I think the side plots are all actually really, really good. It's the main plot, once we get into it, that is the weakness. It's actually the villains in a way that are the strength in a way, but actually a weakness compared to the others. But we'll obviously discuss these kind of talking points as we get through it. That's just a general kind of idea about how I kind of feel about the book. But I think this is a very good start to the season in that it links into what Korra said in her speech from the finale of Book 2 about her sensing a change in the planet's energy and what possible effect that could have. And we immediately see spirit vines in Republic City, and as we learn by the end, kind of permanent, like they won't go away. So there is now a permanent kind of like spirit haven in a way within Republic City, and spirits now being in the world, you know, they're starting to live there. And there's immediately this kind of conflict around spirits not really respecting humans' customs and just kind of, starting to live wherever. And, you know, we don't address it too much. The book isn't about the spirits as such. They kind of use the spirit vines here and a little bit later as like a plot point of just the spirit vines themselves. But the actual dealing with the spirits isn't really a plot point as such in this book. They're just kind of there to show a change. But the main change, of course, is the airbenders. And I love the start of just kind of seemingly random scene with Boomy and Boomju. I'm like, okay, cool, spirit. Boomju's still here, showing the spirits in the world. Boomy is actually quite spiritual. But then the whole scene of him, like, little argument with Boomju, falls off the cliff and uses airbending to save himself. And it's like, oh, what are they doing here? Boomy's now an airbender. And when it comes to, like, addressing it, like, once everyone figures it out, it's kind of like, was he always just an airbender, but he's a super late bloomer, or did harmonic convergence do something? And I think the interpretation that we were meant to have is that when harmonic convergence happened and basically the world was engulfed in energy, I think what we're meant to take from it is that interpreting harmonic convergence and what it is, like harmony converging together, it's an event that kind of determines the balance of light and darkness in the world, but does it kind of determine the balance on other fronts? And in this case, it feels like it is the universe attempting to correct the imbalance of different bending abilities within the world. There's only a couple of airbenders. Now there's more airbenders, you know, still keeping them as a fairly small nation, but now a scattered nation. But there's now enough where airbending will kind of survive and thrive going forward. So it's one of those ones where, is this specific with airbending, or say it was actually like the Fire Nation that only had a couple of benders, would there now be people gaining the power of firebending? And the other aspect of this is, I suppose, how does this actually happen? Because they've been very, very specific about the fact that up until basically this episode and the reveal in this episode, bending can only be given, turning a human from just a normal human into a bender, by a line turtle. So what is the harmonic convergence event doing? Is it basically an energy bending wave that kind of has its sort of randomization factor determined by like the balance of the elements? I think that's the way we're meant to interpret it. Where like if harmonic convergence comes and it senses that like, okay, like there's been a war in this time and a lot of waterbenders were wiped out. Maybe there's more waterbenders now. In that the water tribes are still fairly small. Like I assume that it probably ends up maybe potentially also being a factor here, that there probably were a few extra waterbenders born as well here, but because it was more of a kind of like, okay, this isn't as big of an issue as the airbenders, it wasn't as obvious. But that's just speculation about like trying to interpret what exactly the event does. But I love how they show it. They just show Boomy and most of the main cast learning about it through Boomy suddenly getting airbending. And then Mako kind of gives you the kind of bigger picture of like, this is happening scattered kind of in other places, with the introduction of Daw here as our kind of random Republic City person who kind of, based on his attire, seems to have like Earth Kingdom origins potentially, but here he is as an airbender and him being shocked by this and not really knowing what to do, because this is a unique thing of like a person who has lived their whole life not knowing what bending is, but now suddenly having an ability they don't know how to control. Like we've seen like the hunters from beginnings, like they don't have any technique, but they know the basics of like, I can fire, and they have a level of control over it even if they don't have much technique. But just complete lack of control over the element is kind of a unique kind of factor here. But it's well done. It sets up a couple of things for us of like, okay, the spirit vines have affected Mako and Bolin's apartment, so they can't live there. Bolin has come to live in Air Temple Island. Asami and Korra are kind of hanging out a little bit more, and Mako's hanging out in the office. Getting into the dynamics here, I don't think there's too much to say about Bolin with Varric, I suppose, disappearing, kind of escaping prison, but kind of not really knowing where he is. The whole movers thing is more or less gone. He's still sort of a hero in the city, but he's kind of now back to square one to a degree of like not really having too much of an idea about what he wants to do anymore, but he has these specific talents. So he's sort of like, in a way, Bolin is a little bit lost again, but I suppose he has like where he was really doubting himself in book 2 about it. Here there's a little bit more like, I can accept that there's just nothing happening for me right now, and just being fine with that, being around his friends. The Mako thing, and I suppose what sort of stems off it, how they choose to do the dynamics between the sort of drama-centric characters of Korra, Mako, and Asami, is very interesting in that I don't particularly like the approach they have with Mako, because I ultimately feel it doesn't give anything to him as a character. I don't think it really gives anything to Korra and Asami as a character to have Mako like be awkward around them. It ends up just being a fairly like pointless arc that I don't think resolves itself all that well, because it doesn't really feel like it ever gets resolved. It feels like this is the permanent position of Mako now, to just be this awkward person around Korra and Asami, in that it's not like it's one of those ones where like they resolve it like to where they have a couple of scenes, and it's not that they never talk, but there's a sense of like the writers putting Mako in a position from here on out in the series, more or less, where he's no longer in the position he was in like book 1 and 2, and then to suddenly be like, okay, so what we're going to emphasize this season is Korra and Asami's relationship, which is, I think at a base level, I don't really mind that. I think the problem that I have with it is that they basically put all of the fallout from the relationship drama stuff from book 2 on Mako. And Korra and Asami, it's just like they're past it. And the issue I have with it, I think, is actually more with Asami, of like her being so nonchalant about it, when in a way, like, it is a bit weird that Asami was the one who kind of initiated the like second time of Masami as being a thing, and the fact that it's just one scene very quickly, the girls have just passed it, and Mako's the one kind of staying away from them, super awkward for me, like very little reason, because they never resolve why Asami and Mako broke up for the second time, to the point where like they hinted at it, they more or less said it, but were they actually back together? I think they were, because like you had scenes of like when Mako was arrested, like it clearly being like a "I'm your girlfriend, I'm coming to see you" type thing, and the little jealous kind of moment of like when Korra comes back and Asami sees that like Korra forgets the breakup, um, so it just feels like they forgot about certain things here to make it easier for Korra and Asami to kind of have like a smoother relationship, and just everything was on Mako. And as I said, there's no net benefit to it as well for Mako. Like I don't think he truly develops. They take this like approach of like, oh Mako, like him saying something along the lines of like, I don't need like a girl in my life or something like that he doesn't have to be in a relationship. But it's like, why are you suddenly adding this thing in like Mako's like bad at relationships or anything like that, when like it just is, if it feels like completely unnecessary, and as I said, only kind of has net negatives for the character. There's no benefit from this. It's not like when he kind of fixes things with whatever's going on with Korra and Asami, that his relationship with them is better. He hasn't. I don't remember any scene of note between Mako and Asami basically for like almost the rest of the season. Like that's what's going to be interesting going through book 3 and 4, is to see exactly what they do with it. Mako and Korra have a couple of scenes, but he's sidelined enough from the two of them that it feels like, no. If you were committing to this arc, you need to have more scenes of Mako with the girls. And that's why I think the comics are so important right now. They need to get it right. Whatever resolution they have to Mako's awkwardness around finding out that Asami and Korra are a couple now, they need to nail whatever scene they're doing of him accepting their relationship, or just whatever talk they have. Because it feels like a lot is riding for the character on this. That can this finally be the putting all of this drama behind us once and for all? And it all comes down to like just to the presentation here. Did they forget about even the nature of their poorly done secondary breakup of like both of them saying "I will always love you"? So why does it immediately go back to like Mako being awkward when apparently they've just had a very, very mutual breakup where they've said to each other that they'll always care about each other? Like what's the issue at all in that? Why isn't there a bigger issue between Korra and Asami, who up until this episode, can you really say they've had more than one notable scene together? And that being the scene with the car, where sort of Asami kind of shows Korra that there's kind of more to her than just the kind of like prissy girl, I think was the line that they used. That's the only real scene of substance between Korra and Asami. They just kind of settled them into this very basic, they're all part of the same friend group, but for sure I think the lightest kind of dynamic in the whole group is Korra and Asami up until this point. And we're halfway through the series. So I get why they suddenly decide that, like, okay, we need to develop this. But I think the issue is that obviously Mike and Brian, after the end of the series, came out and basically said that, yeah, but book 3 and 4 is also meant to be sort of set up for Korra Asami's romantic relationship. And the sort of vague, like, retcon confusion around what exactly the interpretation is meant to be. And that I've always interpreted as that basically every scene in book 3 is Korra and Asami's friendship. I personally don't really get a lot of romance set up out of this book. I think it's book 4 where there's a better idea that could actually be a romantic relationship. And we know for sure from the production that they don't really commit to, I think, properly doing anything with that relationship until the very end, when they were kind of shocked that Nickelodeon allowed them to do it. So that's another fun thing that's going to be interesting to do going through these last 2 seasons, is looking out for how many of the scenes between Korra and Asami are actually like setting up their romance, and how much of it is just that these two are relatively underdeveloped with regards to their relationship with each other. We first have to establish any dynamic before we can even think about relationship stuff. Um, so I think that's enough on this kind of team avatar dynamic for now. But yeah, the Tenzin I think is really really good in this episode, because it's a really emotional thing for him to find out that airbenders are coming back. It was one thing of just like him being like happy to see Boomy also be an airbender, and like such a change for him as a character as well. We touch on it I suppose a little bit in the later episodes when he starts to train a bit more, but that's a very meaningful thing for him, kind of feeling like in a way, you know, I took such a different path than you, like when he's talking about Aang, but he tried to still live up to him, but now he kind of has this connection in a way to his father through the airbending. So it's this kind of cool thing to give such an older character later on in his life. And then to find out that there are actually reports of like multiple other airbenders, it's for him his greatest dream coming true, but it's also like a little bit of a sadness of like his father missed the opportunity to see this come to fruition. That this was Aang's greatest dream, was to see the Air Nation return properly with like airbenders, and he obviously sees this as his chance. Like here is suddenly his destiny to, you know, not be Aang, but in Tenzin's own way bring the air nomads back. And we see that over the next couple of episodes, the issues he has with like being over enthusiastic, trying to keep it overly traditional, not really adapting to the fact that these are people from other cultures coming into this. This isn't like the air acolytes and they're volunteers and they purposely want to become part of this. Stuff is going to have to change. There has to be a different approach to this. But I really love that scene with him and the kids, where they're just asking questions of like, you know, they're so used to like air acolytes and just their family dynamic of kind of the air nomads as they are now are just one big family. They all live together. So they're kind of like, does this mean like every single airbender is going to come to the island to like live with us? You know, they're so used to basically airbending being a family thing that they're kind of still like, does that mean like we technically have to treat the other airbenders as family? And obviously it comes from a sort of like, in a way, kind of you basic kind of like icky kind of perspective of this thing. But it's interesting to think about it that way, of just Tenzin kind of telling them like, you're all going to have to get used to not being like super special as being the only airbenders left in the world. It's now there's going to be more airbenders, but you're still going to have to play a role as some of the most experienced airbenders in the world, even though they're very young. And this is obviously going to be a big transition point here for Tenzin of like, he can't do it all. There's enough airbenders where like he can teach a decent amount of them. He's going to have to allow his kids, Jinora especially, to also sort of be a leader of the kind of airbenders going forward. And that's a really cool thing, because it ends up being like Korra's mission. She sort of makes this her mission, her goal. Republic City sort of like, in a way, abandons her in this episode. And we'll talk about Raiko in a second. But I really like that Korra at the end realizes that like, look, I've done everything for this city. If they don't want me, fine. I actually have other things to do as the Avatar. We still have to really travel the world to find out just how widespread the airbender thing is. We have to offer them help, and who better to help them out than, you know, Tenzin. And it's just this idea of, we're going to go on this trip to kind of recruit these airbenders and at least like leave them with information. And it's good because there's a path. It means that Tenzin has something to do here. He's invested in it. And it's, I think, a solid kind of plot to really kick things off, and before the villains, I suppose, properly come into play. But we obviously get there through Raiko basically banishing Korra in a way from the city. And it's just a really poor move. And Raiko throughout this episode is very, very hateable. It's so easy to dislike him. Like, I get he's frustrated that, like, a lot of stuff is happening. He doesn't get what's happening, and he sort of blames it on Korra. But it's like, she, as she points out to him, gets really frustrated with him when he's given the speech. Like, did you want me to not take out the giant spirit of darkness that did this to the city? Did you want worse to happen? Like, I was the only one who could do anything against him, and you're complaining about me? And as well, like, especially the spirit vines, which were his fundamental problem, Raiko caused that. Like, I don't think it was really anyone else's problem. Korra warned him prior to harmonic convergence even happening. This crazy spirit is coming. If you let him attack the city, it's gonna be really, really bad. And all he says is, no, I'll keep the United Forces here to protect the city, completely underestimating what they were actually up against. He took a very, very, very defensive approach instead of an offensive approach, and it backfired. The attacks that Unalaq primarily used to attack the city were spirit vines, and that was what was caused by that. Imagine he had actually went and listened to Korra, Tenzin, and everyone else who like got what the scope of what was happening. If they had used the army to attack harmonic convergence, they probably could have closed the portals. They would have had enough support there to easily break through the Northern Water Tribe kind of support. There'd be much more people around to where the sort of overpowering of basically Team Avatar in the finale of Book 2 wouldn't have happened, and there'd be no spirit vines. There'd probably be some effect of things just because spirit energy is going to do stuff, but nothing to this scale. And it's his fault that he made a poor decision and now is kind of dealing with the results of that, and is putting all of the blame on Korra, who's the only one who can do anything to stop this. And it kind of forces her into a position where she has to do stuff like spirit bend the vines off the building, but then it goes wrong, and that causes an issue. And it's like, what do you want me to do? Like, you sort of want me to do everything, but then want me to leave. And it's just, what are you actually hoping to accomplish here? That's just, it's Raiko getting frustrated with Korra for very little reason. And I think the media is interesting in the situation here because, like, they see that, like, he, in front of the media, banishes Korra from the city, and that can't be a well-received thing, unless it really is the kind of narrative coming out of things that the Avatar is responsible for all of this. Raiko just very, very hard to like here. I think this is one of some of his worst decisions we really get here. The one from the end of Book 2 is like, okay, but this one is just really, really bad. Especially like the whole like the final straw ends up being like, I saved a person who was endangering himself on top of a bridge. What? Like the scene that leads to like the banishment is just kind of like, how dare you save this person's life? Like, how dare we clear off the road so it's safe? Like, what? And again, he's trying to blame her for the fact that, like, the only reason this happened is because, like, it's an airbender, which is because of stuff that you did. But it's kind of like, you also didn't help the situation yourself, Raiko, and stuff like that. And that, like, if Korra wasn't here, what would have happened here? Would you just let some guy fall off the roof and the bridge and kill himself? So it's just very much a case of, all he is doing is basically assigning blame elsewhere, deflecting it away from himself, and doing nothing to solve the issues, basically. Which ends up being Raiko's entire run as president, basically, of just, he never acts, he never makes any sort of a move to really try and fix anything. It's always just, he waits until something happens, and then doesn't do enough when it happens to actually react or save anything. So, it's to the point where I'm kind of like, was it always the case where, like, they were purposefully trying to write him as a bad president? Because I at the time, I remember I was always critical of Raiko, and I got a little bit of, like, backlash of people saying, no, Raiko's position is a bit more understandable. But especially in, like, the comics now, it feels like the writers are purposely writing him in a way where you're meant to, like, rip into him about how bad he is as a president. In that, like, anyone but Raiko, Julie, absolutely come in and be the president. It feels like there's no issue whatsoever. Like, just let her be the president. How could anyone vote for Raiko? What has he actually done? And it's really frustrating for when you're thinking about, like, Korra's perspective of just the fact that she has to deal with this guy. And even in the comics right now, it's still the same way. It's just she hates having to deal with Raiko because she gets nothing from him. She does everything for the city. Like by the end of this series, like sacrificed like herself, her body, everything, amount of time, effort for the city, and gets very, very little back. Even when she eventually is praised as like a hero of the city, there's still like, oh, he comes back and is against her the next time something happens. It's really bad. But I suppose we'll touch on the Zahir scene and then fill in everything else we haven't covered. I like the introduction of the Red Lotus. Obviously, I'll end up over the course of these episodes of Book 3 talking about my criticisms of the Red Lotus, and there are many, but the introduction I think is quite good in that, like, okay, White Lotus prison, guy talking about like ancient airbender kind of poetry and wisdom. He as a villain is one of the people to get airbending, because obviously the guards are shocked that he has it, so he wasn't an airbender beforehand. So he's kind of like, what did a non-bender do to warrant this? So there's a lot of like questions about him, that like, why is he put in such a high security prison like this? And then him running off basically saying that the White Lotus are going to come to an end, as well as the Avatar. It's big lofty goals, and we'll see that, okay, they have the firepower to accomplish this. The problem is the characters, the lack of backstory. Everything is tell instead of being shown, which is very different than the previous two villains, who got backstories, had flashbacks, and you got a sense of who they were as kind of characters. They take a different approach here. Even in Book 4 with Kuvira, they take a different approach with how they do the villain, and I don't feel it works as well as it did with the Book 1 and 2 villains. The problem is, like, I think, sort of present from the get-go, of, okay, he has airbending, he's one of the people who got it with harmonic convergence. How does he immediately know how to do it so well that he can beat White Lotus guards? Who, I get it. I get White Lotus guards have been sort of, like, powered down compared to the White Lotus we know from ATLA. But they're still meant to fundamentally be like random Dai agent level of like power as a specific bender. So the fact that a random airbender can just like take out all these guards so easily, I get they were taken by surprise, but for someone who shouldn't be that good, hasn't had that much time to practice, is absolutely the implication given the timing of everything. I get he's apparently, research, airbender poetry, but to suddenly say that, like, I know all the theory of fighting, so I immediately know how to perform airbending moves, it's very, very, like, unexplained. Especially because they never give him a backstory, so they never really touch on, like, his martial arts background, because we never see him do, like, non-bender fighting, as much as they, like, tell you basically that he was involved in big things as part of the Red Lotus and is put in prison as a threat. We just never get it explained, to the point where we have to go to the Nickelodeon website to really get the like basic backstory of, like, he is a warrior poet. He knows martial arts, and poetry is like his big thing. You get the poetry part here, and I suppose the implication of the martial arts, but just the fact that, like, we have to go to a website to even get it at all confirmed that, like, okay, he's meant to be a martial artist beforehand, so that explains some of the immediate skill with bending. And the problem is that he's part of the Red Lotus, so he's part of an organization. They never explain how he becomes part of the organization, and they never explain his motives, really, for, like, why he believes in the ideals of the Red Lotus so much. And then I think the biggest issue here is the White Lotus plot gets dropped completely in a couple of episodes. Like, it's like 3 or 4, episode 3 or 4, and just the White Lotus aren't a factor in the entire book. And it's just kind of like, you clearly set up a Red Lotus, White Lotus scenario. Where did that go to? So it's frustrating for me, because I think there's so much potential with these villains. Zahir especially, and even the other three with their unique abilities. There's a fascinating backstory, I think, waiting to be told with all of them. They just don't give it to us. And I think a huge part of what made Amon so interesting, what makes Unalaq so interesting, is that backstory, explaining why Amon is the leader of this, Equals organization against Benders. Why Unalaq is so spiritual, what he did in the past to get this power, and why this this plot that he's trying to accomplish means so much to him. You get a little bit more Unalaq backstory here, which is really interesting in that it adds so much to Unalaq, but you're adding more to the villain you just killed off than you are to these new 4 villains who I think the writers knew from the start that there would be an immediate hype around these 4 villains because of the nature of their powers and their approach to how they just go for people basically, and they are not afraid to kill people, and they tonally do some interesting stuff with them when they're involved in fights. But I think there's not a lot of substance to this group outside of their bending powers, because I feel it's also the weakest kind of ideology of a villain as well, this book. The whole just freedom, but it basically is anarchy, and I think it's the one where it's the easiest one to be just yeah, that's kind of stupid, because Zahir I think is made out to be quite foolish by book 4, of just basically I didn't know that me creating chaos in the world would leave a power vacuum for a tyrant to take over, and it's just duh, what were you expecting to happen? It's just it ends up being kind of that level of silliness in a way, I think, with the ideology here, where I don't think the same is really present for the other villains. I get the character is fundamentally Zahir is a good speaker and presents his points well, but when you really break down what he's actually trying to accomplish, it is a bit okay, it ends up having big effects because it causes so much chaos, but by the end he's defeated, and then he opposes the next villain that comes into play. It's just you had to know that this would happen, that the world couldn't just exist in the state that you hoped it would, with you kind of having caused what you caused. And yeah, it's just, I think the book 3 villains are just an example of them feeling that all they had to do is make them cool characters and not actually have to characterize them, explain their ideology and so on. And it's worse, of course, with the others. Zahir at least is okay as the leader of the group, but Ghazan, Minghua, especially those two, there's nothing really to them. Pali has a little bit more to her, but it's just a small bit more than them, and the group, I think, overall does suffer. As cool as they are in fight scenes, I think Avatar and Korra is at its best with strong characterization, and so when villains basically have very little characterization, to me I see that as a flaw, and for the most part don't get the overhype of the book 3 villains are the best, book 3 is the best because it's got the best villains. I'm just kind of does it? And I think that's almost the thing, people almost they're so hyped up about the powers that they just forget about the backstory. And as I said, the whole show us don't tell us thing needed to be, I think, taken advantage of here. There's a lot of stuff that we get hinted at, mentioned, but they should have shown us, and we'll discuss it when the reveal with Korra comes out, about what actually led to her being kept in the compound in the south, and the first Red Lotus attack, I suppose. That is a scene that I think they should have shown some of it. That is not something to just say in dialogue and kind of brush aside. But anyway, we'll get to that when it's brought out properly. But yeah, back to this episode. The strength of this one is how they world build basically in the aftermath of Harmonic Convergence. Korra is a much more developed character, because of what just happened. And you can see that her conversation with Daw here, especially, even the conversation that she has with Tenzin, of just kind of her reflecting on the fact of like, have I done too much here? Did I change too much? Everyone seems annoyed about this. But Tenzin just pointing out that like, people are going to think very differently about everything. I personally love this decision because look what it's done for the world. The airbenders are coming back, and I think that's, you've accomplished something in doing that that very few avatars can say they have. And that kind of confidence allows her to, I think, really use her development from book 2 to handle the Daw situation in an interesting way, where she kind of gets him on board with the kind of airbender plan and calms him down. Has to save him in the end when he falls off, but you know, still, like, you could see her goal, her path. It's just, I think the unfortunate thing about book 3 is that it's Korra's it's the book where Korra is, I suppose, the least important with regards to like her arc as a character, because she doesn't really necessarily have a complete arc across the book. It's just helping out the airbenders and then kind of trying not to get captured by the Red Lotus, and then the sacrifice at the end. It's fine, but like compared to like the development she went on in book 1, in book 2, where she goes in book 4, this really stands out as a book where she doesn't progress all that much. What's good about it is that you get to see a lot of her, because for a lot of it, she's not really involved in the main plot as such. She's not fighting the villains for most of the book. You kind of just get to see her kind of do stuff normally as the Avatar now that she's developed, and it's Korra in a way at her most likable, but it's because of obviously the development that's come before, and it'll let down a little bit by not really having much development within this book, where it's, I think, a lot of the side plots where the development really happens. Tenzin, Jinora, Kai, Mako Bolin and their family, Lin meeting her family, you know, Su Yin being introduced, Opal gets a little arc. All of that stuff is like good. It's just Korra, this is the one book where Korra doesn't really have an arc. If anyone's been following my channel for a while, you'll know that while Korra was airing on the site, Avatar The Last Airbender Online.com, after the end of every book, we did what we called the book awards. So we had book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, separate awards, loads of different categories, from like best character, best quote, best like fight scene, stuff like that. And there was also best character development. Korra won the best character development in all of the books except book 3. And I think that is really, really telling, that Korra was not even close in the voting for best character development for book 3. I think Jinora won it in the end, and like it was basically between her and Tenzin, I think, were the main ones. I think Lin was in there as well, but I think Jinora won, I think rightfully so, as well. But yeah, that's my thoughts on A Breath of Fresh Air. I think it's a good episode. I think it begins to sort of bring in some of the issues that I have with the book, and we'll obviously get to them later on as they go through. But once again, just the thing of, I like what goes on with a lot of the side plots. I don't find the main plot to be as strong as a lot of people do. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.